Yeah, for sure.
Nice.
So you just take some break. Option of having.
Yes.
Do you know? I'm gonna check this. Two people have always said that.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah, because I was a paddler.
No, and I blew it on something for you guys.
Big fan of yours, by the way, though. I studied at there. Yeah. So I've been reading your stuff for a while now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good. That's what I keep
Yeah, I used to work on that actually.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, no, these are pretty good.
Awesome. Great.
All right.
Yeah, maybe we should.
So at one, the dean. Outside, and I have the Q&A microphones, so
Oh, yeah, no,
when
I
you
know
open it up for Q&A,
we have to get them on the
just
mic.
say, like, raise your hand and then I'll go to people.
And I'm okay.
To you,
Okay.
that's really flexible.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Fred.
We've, my colleague Casey's back there. We've
Okay.
tested out the stream is already running
Okay.
actually, so we're all set with
Okay.
that.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks. So you'll use that mic.
Yeah. I'm just going to introduce you and then I'm going to sit down.
Yeah, I'll just
Okay.
just sit over here.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for braving the elements to come over to SIS, or for those of you in a colder, for me, I'm in a colder part of SIS, so it's great to be here in the Abramson Family Founders Room. And it's always exciting to have a book launch, book talk, so we're really thrilled that David Bosco has produced Rough Justice, which follows his earlier work on the United Nations, Five to Rule Them All. There must be some kind of package deal you can get with the two combined. But as many of you know, David is a professor here in the School of International Service. As I mentioned, this is his second book, studying a relatively new international institution and one that has been the subject of quite a bit of controversy and a lot of interesting discussion with respect both to how the great powers view the institution, and certainly with its birth, a lot of interesting dynamics between the ICC and the United States, and also a lot of interesting discussion with respect to who gets brought before the ICC and from which countries. And I know all of these things are going to be things that David mentions. David comes to SIS with a background in law and international law. He has a JD from Harvard. He's worked as a lawyer. He also, as many of you know, blogs. It used to be the Multilateralist blog at Foreign Policy. With their new format, he is now a voice at Foreign Policy, and you can continue to follow him there. And he is also, for those of you who've been in his classes, know that he's one of the most popular professors that we have here in SIS, and teaches, among other things, our big introductory course for the undergraduates on the introduction to world politics. We are using the hashtag #RoughJusticeICC if you would like to tweet during this event, as I hope to do momentarily. And with that, I just want to turn the floor over to Dave and just say congratulations on producing another excellent book.
Thank you very much. There's something I'm supposed to do with that. Out here, I know it's not a very hospitable day, but it's great to see so many folks here, including former students, current students, and colleagues. Before I kind of launch into a discussion of the themes in the book, I do want to take the opportunity to thank a number of people who really helped me out with this project. Dean Goldgeier being first and foremost. I think Dean Goldgeier has been incredibly supportive of all of us who are working on projects like this. and really helped me throughout this process. I wanted to thank also the International Affairs Research Institute and MANA in particular, who helped organize a kind of day-long session where people tore apart the book, and I eventually put it back together again, and it was really, really helpful. So thank you to them. The research assistant who worked on this project for longer than she probably cares to mention, Jasanth Planer, is here, MA graduate of SIS, and now working at the Enough Project on some of the same issues that the book touches on. So Jasanth, thank you for all of your incredibly hard work on this project. And a number of colleagues took the time to read versions of multiple versions of different chapters and probably never want to see the book again. But in any case, thank you to all of them. It's really been kind of a community effort in many respects. So to kind of launch into the way that I'm approaching the ICC, I think it's important to talk first about the broader trajectory of international justice. And here we're talking about international criminal justice, which is the idea that for certain grave crimes, individuals, be they heads of state, heads of militaries, defense ministers, whatever, should be held accountable. And this is a relatively new idea in international relations, and it's obviously something that was born in many respects, or certainly got its most famous initiation with the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials after World War II. But for many decades after that point, the notion of international criminal justice really seemed to be frozen or to have been a kind of passing phenomenon in international relations, because when we go into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the notion of holding people accountable at an international level for crimes really disappears. But as many of you will know, and many of you have been involved in firsthand, this whole project of international criminal justice has experienced a remarkable and dramatic rebirth since the early 1990s. And it really was with the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the Tribunal for Rwanda that international criminal justice is kind of back in the thick of international affairs and becomes a potent force. And it's really from those roots that the International Criminal Court, which, as Dean Goldgeier mentioned, is a quite new international institution, emerges. And it seemed quite natural to many people, that if we were going to have ad hoc tribunals set up to deal with this crisis or this conflict, why wouldn't we simply have a permanent international court that stood ready to investigate and prosecute people for some of the most serious crimes, including genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes? And that push then, that process culminates in a major diplomatic conference in 1998 in Rome that goes on for weeks and weeks. And I remember following it very closely at the time, and I was actually following it from Bosnia, where I was working on issues, some issues related to war crimes there. And then over in Rome, international negotiators were debating how do we create this permanent court. And it's overwhelmingly approved. The vote is something like 120-7 in favor of creating a permanent court. The court then opens its doors and becomes fully operational in 2002. And since then, a very large number of states have taken the step of formally joining the institution, which is not an easy process because you've got to ratify, you've got to change some of your domestic laws, you've got to go through a number of steps. But if we look, it's rather remarkable that more than 120 states have joined the International Criminal Court, become permanent members. And so I think there is this narrative about international justice since the 1990s that we're kind of moving, we're on a path. We've had the ad hoc tribunals that led to pressure for a permanent court. The permanent court is overwhelmingly approved. States are coming on board. And there's this kind of inexorable logic to it. And that narrative is in some respects true, obviously. But I'm trying to focus on a different narrative and a different reality, which is that the ICC, while it is the culmination in some ways of Nuremberg, of the ad hoc tribunals, also represents an important departure from other international institutions and other international courts. And it's that departure that I really focus on in the book. The traditional view of how international institutions are created is that powerful states get together and they kind of decide what they want out of an international institution, what purpose they want it to serve. They decide on the basic parameters, and then they make changes around the edges as necessary to bring in the rest of the international community, or as much of the international community as can be brought in. And if we look at, for example, the negotiations that produced the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, other major international institutions, that is very much the process that was followed. It was a process of the big, or several big powers at least, deciding this is what we want, and then negotiating around the edges to get broad-based participation. That is not the model that the ICC followed. That is not the process from which the ICC emerged. And in fact, the ICC emerged from a radically different process, as Simmons and Danner have called it, a stunning change of course. And it's a stunning change of course because the push for the ICC, the real advocacy for the court, was from smaller states, it was from middle powers, and many of the large states, the major powers, were either skeptical to the process or, in some cases, hostile to it. And so we have a very different process with the ICC, and in a very sensitive area of security, military affairs, and the resulting court really represents an unprecedented threat to the sovereignty of even powerful states, because we have now an institution that claims the right to be able to put on trial heads of state, really any head of state around the world, given certain conditions, any minister of defense, for certain crimes. And that is a remarkable change in international relations and a departure from where we've been previously. This was, I would say, the central issue at stake in the Rome Conference negotiations that produced the ICC, was this question of what kind of control, what kind of influence are major powers going to have over this institution? And so it was really this question of, in particular, what role is the UN Security Council, which is, of course, dominated by key major powers, what role are they going to have in managing international justice through the ICC? And this was not lost on delegates who were engaged in the negotiations at Rome. And I talked to one delegate who said, look, a lot of what happened at Rome during these negotiations that produced the ICC was a rerun of the 1945 negotiations about the UN and about the Security Council and about the veto power. And as he put it, things are different this time, and the large guys, the powerful states, weren't going to get away with it this time. They weren't going to be able to create special privileges for themselves. They wanted to have, these delegates like this wanted to have an international institution that could reach the powerful as well as the weak. And so this was a central theme during the negotiations that produced the court. And so what we get out of that process then is a court over which the major powers have relatively few levers of control. They do not have the kind of control that they have over other international institutions through either, say, the veto power at the UN or a large voting share at the World Bank or the IMF, or even in other international courts. The major powers have more levers of control, or at least levers to protect themselves from the institution in question. And this is then a critical difference between the ICC and both the Nuremberg and the ad hoc tribunals, which were, in many respects, under the control of the big powers. Nuremberg was run by the prevailing Allied powers, And the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda were created by the UN Security Council, and so created, in a sense, by the big powers. So, for that reason, because of their lack of control over the institution, many powerful states have decided, we'd rather not be part of this. And so if you look at the major powers, and here in the book I've designated the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and the 4 key aspiring would-be permanent members of the Security Council, Japan, India, Germany, and Brazil, as the major powers, you find that there's a big split here. You've got several of the major powers have joined the court, but many have not, including the superpower, the United States, and the largest emerging power, China. Okay, and then you've got actually a number of other large states that I don't classify as major powers who have not joined the court. And so, thinking back to our slide on what the world looks like from a perspective of who's joined the court, now let's look at what the world looks like from a different lens. If you total up global armed forces, people under arms, you find that the vast majority of people under arms are in non-member states. And if you look at world population, you find that the large majority, again, are in non-member states. And this is just an illustration of the reality that some of the world's largest, most powerful states have not joined the court, have stayed away from it. So, the starting point really for the book is that the International Criminal Court is not simply another new international institution. It's not simply a logical extension of the ad hoc tribunals. It is an anomalous institution that was born with a weak connection to major powers. And it's with a weak connection because many have decided not to join, because those who have decided to join have relatively few levers of control. And so the question is, what happens to an international institution in a situation like this? It's kind of uncharted territory from the perspective of the study of international organizations. And it's particularly notable and particularly salient because this court relies on states. It relies on state support. The ICC has a headquarters, and it's got judges, and it's got a prosecutor, but it has no police force. It's entirely dependent on states for its budget. It's entirely dependent on states for diplomatic and political support. And so it needs the states, and it particularly needs the most powerful states, and yet either they're not members or there's a weak connection between them. So the book then is an attempt really to try to understand what has happened to this institution. The court has been operating now for more than a decade. I think it is possible to make a preliminary assessment. It has to be preliminary. We're only 11 years into the court's operation, 12 years into the court's operations. But I think it is possible to step back now and say, well, what do we see so far for an institution designed like this? And what I do in the book then is to kind of provide a structure for the analysis of what is really the diplomatic history of the court over the last decade plus, is to try to identify several different behavior patterns that we might expect from major powers facing an institution like this. And this draws on different elements of both international relations theory and also some international legal scholarship that's been done. And the major behavior patterns that I identify are the following. The first would be marginalization. That a major power used to having significant control over an international institution, faced with an international institution over which they don't have control in a very sensitive area, will try to marginalize that institution to make sure it doesn't pose a threat to their vital interests. And that marginalization can happen, I argue, in active and passive ways, but essentially what you'd expect is that these states would attack the defects of the organization, they would try to starve the court of resources, they would try to use their leverage to weaken support for the institution from smaller states, at the very least, in a kind of passive sense, they would decline to offer support. Okay, they would decline to offer support for the institution. That's what you would expect for marginalization behavior. There's another alternative that I think is, and this is particularly well covered in some of the international legal literature, is the issue of control. So, faced with this institution, let's just say you decide not to marginalize it, you try to figure out a way to control it, okay, to make sure that it's not doing things that are hostile or dangerous to you. And there are different ways in which you might try to control it. You might try to exploit whatever formal levers that you have, and there aren't many, but there is, for example, the UN Security Council has a role to play in the operations of the court. Specifically, it can refer cases to the court, and it can also temporarily put on hold ICC cases. And so you would expect them to use that formal lever of control, limited as it is, to the fullest extent. Then you would expect major powers to engage in other kinds of control behavior. They could put political pressure on the court. They could use whatever financial leverage they have, particularly if a major power is a member of the court and contributes significantly to the court's budget. They could say, look, before we write this check for what we owe for the ICC this year, we want to talk about how the institution is operating. Okay, so different informal levers. And in terms of supporting the court, and when the court asks for the help of a major power, you might expect that they would say yes when it serves their interests and no when it doesn't. So that would be kind of control behavior. The third possibility, and the most sanguine from the court's perspective, is acceptance. That the major powers will decide, well, we're not comfortable fully with this institution. We've had our differences, but we need to come to terms with it. Overall, this institution is in our interests, and let's back it. And you could arrive at this kind of behavior through a couple of different routes. You could have a kind of rationalist approach where the state, the major power, kind of weighs up the costs and the benefits of the ICC and says, in the aggregate, it's in our interests. We realize if we don't provide consistent support for it, it's not going to be a useful tool. Therefore, we'll do that. Or, more along the lines that someone like Sickink has argued, major powers could be swayed by the normative power of the institution. This is an institution designed to combat the worst atrocities that are committed out there. And there are people within these countries and activists who will try to get these states to back this institution. And so, Sickink talks about this dramatic new trend in world politics toward holding individual state officials criminally accountable. That has a powerful appeal to many people. And you might expect that this will have an influence on major powers. Over time, they will come to support the court, to accept it, because of the norms and values that it represents. And I think if you look at what NGO leaders and activists were saying at the time of the Rome Conference, and in the early days of the court, I think this is kind of what they expected would happen. And this is a quote actually from Richard Dicker of Human Rights Watch, who was one of the central players in terms of the advocacy for the court. And he said, look, we realize this is a problem that a lot of the big players aren't members of this institution, but we're going to rely on the quantitative mass of the numbers of states that do support it and this sense of momentum, and we're going to hope that that will pull along the major powers, that they'll get over their reluctance because of this kind of normative train that is leaving the station. So those then are the three behavior patterns that I think are most likely, either marginalization of an active or passive sort, control behavior, or acceptance. But I try not to examine only state behavior or major power behavior. I also try to treat the court itself as an important actor whose behavior needs to be analyzed. And this is in line with some important scholarship that's been done in the last couple of decades, particularly Barnett and Finnemore, but others have followed along in these lines, saying, look, we need to treat international institutions as actors in their own right, and we need to look at what choices they're making, how they're using whatever discretion they have, and there are a couple of ways in which that becomes relevant for the ICC. So Barnett and Finnemore talk about different kinds of authority that an international institution can have. And two, I think, are particularly relevant for the ICC. First of all, delegated authority. The ICC, through the Rome Statute, has been delegated an important responsibility, investigating and prosecuting these crimes, and the Rome Statute creates a very wide area of discretion for the prosecutor in particular. The prosecutor has very wide discretion as to which cases to bring, which individuals to indict, what situations to examine, and which ones to leave aside. So that discretion then becomes an element in assessing how the court itself is acting. And as I've already kind of indicated, you would expect that the court and court officials would have significant moral authority, that they would, as the representatives of an institution designed to provide accountability for some of these heinous crimes, they would have a certain moral authority to say, look, this is what we think as the court, this is what we think the proper course of action is here, and to use that moral authority to gain leverage over states and other actors who support the court needs. And so I come up with then, and here I'm a little bit more on uncharted terrain because there hasn't been a lot of work looking at how international prosecutors work, but I come up with several different behavior patterns that you might expect in terms of how the prosecutor, an international prosecutor, is going to operate vis-a-vis major powers out there who support the prosecutor needs. The first, and this is the one that a lawyer would hope would be the case, would be apolitical. My job is to be a prosecutor. I look at the facts, I look at the law, and I go where the facts and the law take me, and I don't care what Washington thinks about whether this investigation is good, and I don't care what Moscow thinks or Beijing. My job is to follow the facts and the law where they lead. That's the apolitical possibility, and I would say it's the kind of default assumption of most people who kind of have their hearts really in international law. You would expect these officials to be apolitical. A second possibility is that they would be pragmatic, that they would be apolitical in the sense that that's how they'd come up with their strategy, but they'd also realize, look, if I want to launch an investigation of crimes committed in Afghanistan, I need support from NATO. I need support from the United States. There's no way I'm going to Afghanistan to investigate if Washington doesn't want that. And so that's a pragmatic approach. You take into account the preferences and the interests of major powers, but only so far as to ensure the feasibility of an investigation. Two other possibilities. The strategic possibility, that the prosecutor operates in such a way as to build relationships with key major powers whose support he or she is going to need for years and years across a variety of different cases. And you need to figure out how to build a good relationship between this new, in some ways revolutionary institution and the major powers out there. And so if you're taking it into account to that extent, I would call that a strategic approach. Finally, there is the possibility that the prosecutor simply will be captured by the major powers, and that the prosecutor will basically take direction, and that somebody will call up from a major power capital and say, this is what we want. That's an unlikely possibility, I think, but I think it's worth, the notion of capture of international institutions is an important one. I think it's a possibility worth considering. So my central argument then, based on this kind of structuring of both major power behavior and court behavior, my central argument is that over the decade plus that the ICC has been in existence, we've had a process of mutual accommodation between major powers and the court. And they've both given ground, essentially, to prevent, thus far, a direct clash between this new international institution that represents international justice and the interests of the most powerful states in the system. And I want to walk you through a little bit how I reach that central argument. First of all, just a word on methodology. The book is done in narrative, historical form. It's really, as with the first book, it's really a diplomatic history, but informed by this analytical structure that I've outlined. And really at the centerpiece of the book is interviews with almost 100 court officials and major power officials, because as you'll undoubtedly understand, the kinds of things I'm trying to understand about the court and how it interacts with major powers are not the kind of things that you'll necessarily find in a court official report or, President Obama's latest speech on international justice. You've got to cut through that and understand, okay, who called who, what kind of interactions are there on an informal basis. And so it's a quite challenging research task, and Jasanth paid the price for a lot of that. Figuring out what individuals can we talk to, who will talk to us, who will talk on what basis. That was really kind of at the heart of this project. And I ended up, I think, reaching a very good number of people who had interesting information on the court, including the former prosecutor with whom I spent probably 12 hours talking about the history of the court. So what emerges from this then? Well, the first thing, I think, is that marginalization as a strategy failed. Marginalization was attempted by certain of the major powers, most notably by the United States during the first Bush administration, but also in a more passive sense by several other major powers. But marginalization failed. And the way that we know it failed is really this moment in early 2005 during the height of the Darfur crisis in Sudan, when a lot of people were looking at the atrocities being committed there, which many people were calling genocide, and saying, where is the ICC? We created this international institution to address situations like this. Why is the ICC not investigating Sudan? And the answer was, well, they didn't have jurisdiction because Sudan was not a member. The crimes were being committed by Sudanese. And so the only way the court was going to get jurisdiction was through action by the UN Security Council to give the court jurisdiction. And initially, the position of the United States and Russia and China was, no, we don't support this institution. We think it has major defects. We're not going to give this court legitimacy by conferring jurisdiction on it. This breaks down, however, in the face of some very savvy diplomacy from the British and the French, who worked assiduously to basically force Washington into the position of choosing between their dislike of the ICC and justice in Sudan. And they really put the Bush administration in a bind. From what I understand, there were quite heated discussions within the administration, including, as you can imagine, John Bolton had some choice words to say about what course of action should be taken. But ultimately, the decision was taken, and President Bush took it himself. I care more about dealing with Sudan, or at least appearing to deal with Sudan, than I do about the ICC, so we'll acquiesce. We'll go along with a referral of the situation to the ICC. And that was really the end of the marginalization campaign. At that point, the United States had decided we're going to live with this institution because you can't confer legitimacy on it, confer jurisdiction on it, and simultaneously say this is an illegitimate institution. And in a less dramatic way, I think that marked the end of China and Russia's notion about kind of marginalizing the institution as well. So marginalization then fails, and it fails in large part, I think, because of some of those factors that I talked about when I talked about acceptance, the normative power of the court. Even powerful states wanted to avoid being seen as getting in the way of international justice. And you see this again and again throughout the court's early history. This has power. and it's able to influence and perhaps even sway major power officials. In a similar vein, other evidence of this kind of normative power, I talked to a Japanese diplomat who was working on the question of whether Japan should join the court. And Japan had been quite skeptical during the Rome Conference. They didn't join when many other states joined. And so it came to 2005, and they had to face the choice of whether we join or not. And officials within the Japanese Foreign Ministry were actively lobbying to join because they said, this is the kind of institution we should be joining. We believe in these kind of principles. We should be associated with this project. So you see that, that normative power of the court having an influence on major powers. But the end of marginalization, I argue, does not imply that we've moved into the world of acceptance. Does not imply that major powers have decided we're going to live with this and we're going to support it consistently. Instead, I argue, we are primarily in a world of control behavior by major powers toward the court. And I want to talk through a couple of mechanisms. So the Security Council, I've already alluded to the fact that the Security Council has a role to play in the ICC through its referral power and through its deferral power. I said at the outset that if you're in control behavior, you would expect to see that power used whenever possible to try to influence the trajectory of the institution. And we have seen, to the great surprise of many, 2 different times during which the Security Council has referred cases to the ICC. Sudan, as I've already mentioned, also Libya. In 2011, Libya was referred by the Security Council. And these Security Council referrals then have allowed major powers to have a significant influence on the court docket. Because when the Security Council refers a situation, that is some of the most powerful states in the world saying to this young, fragile institution, we want you to investigate here. Now, the ICC is not obliged to. It could say, no, we don't want to investigate, but there's an enormous amount of pressure on them to launch investigations. And in both cases, Sudan and Libya, they did. They launched very quickly, full-scale, resource-intensive investigations of the behavior that the Security Council had referred. But, and here's a key point, when the Security Council referred these situations, they in no way committed themselves to provide resources to the court or political or military backup to the court. They did not tie their hands in any way or commit to courses of action that would boost the court's overall standing and overall resources. To the contrary, when those referrals went through, the United States insisted, under both the Bush and Obama administrations, that there were going to be riders in those resolutions saying, no UN resources for the court. And the court cannot investigate the nationals of any non-member states other than the state that whose activity we're referring to the court. So some very significant restrictions on court activity through these Security Council referrals. And so it has dawned on people who watch the court closely, and I talked to a large number of UN diplomats from smaller states who realized, we were kind of excited when the first referral happened, this major power legitimization of the court, and now we kind of realize this is a major lever of control over the institution. And people have said, and this is from what was an off-the-record session of diplomats with the prosecutor up in New York, some small state diplomat said to the prosecutor, we don't really like this situation because if the prosecutor is financially constrained overall because states don't give all that much money to the court, but whenever the Security Council says investigate this, the court jumps and investigates, that means there are fewer resources available for things that the court might want to do, but that the major powers might not want. And so in a sense, the Security Council referrals have been quite important ways of managing the docket of the ICC. Another important mechanism of control is actually through the formal process of amending the Rome Statute, which has happened just once. It happened in 2010 over the absolutely critical question of how to define aggression, which has been, for most of recorded history, undefined in legal terms. The ICC actually has jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, and they had to figure out in 2010 how to define it and how to operationalize that for the court. And so all of the member states of the court showed up to negotiate that, and the non-member states showed up. And so Washington and Beijing and Moscow, you can bet, and I know, sent very large delegations to this conference to engage in negotiations about how aggression was going to be defined and how it was going to be operationalized for an institution that they do not belong to. And they had, because they're major powers, significant influence over those negotiations on aggression. And the end result was a definition of aggression and an operationalization of aggression that essentially immunizes the major power. It immunizes any state that hasn't joined the court or that decides they don't want to be prosecuted for aggression. Every state can simply opt out of that. And so aggression really can only reach those states who've decided, we're willing to be prosecuted for aggression if you decide that we've committed aggression. So that was an important element of control, and it was non-members acting in concert with certain member states to really restrict the court's ability to prosecute that crime. A much more subtle mechanism of control has been managing the information flow to the court. The court, any prosecutor, lives or dies by information. Who did what to whom? What intercepts do we have? What forensics do we have? A lot of that information is in the hands of major powers because they have the intelligence services, they have the satellites, they have the mechanisms of saying, yeah, you want to know what Sudanese army battalion was where in Darfur on what date? We can tell you that. There are some other people who can tell you that too, including the Enough Project. But mostly it's in the hands of major power. And when the court decided they were curious about the situation in Afghanistan, where there's an intense conflict, atrocities clearly have been committed, they wanted to possibly investigate that. The prosecutor's office sent out a letter to NATO states saying, could you please tell us what information you have about crimes being committed in Afghanistan? Now, NATO has zero interest in having the ICC involved in Afghanistan because you've got thousands of NATO troops there. They might, at the very least, they'd have to try to provide security for the ICC. In the worst case scenario, the ICC might start looking at NATO behavior. What's going on in that prison? What are you doing with the people you've detained? NATO had zero interest in this. And so the response to this letter from the ICC asking for information was silence. So major powers have a lot of control over information that the court needs, and they're able to use that information flow to guide the court in certain ways. It's hard to open a formal investigation when you don't have the information you need. And that was also an important signal about NATO's preferences in terms of an Afghan investigation. There's also informal pressure, signaling. The United States, U.S. officials made quite clear to the ICC that there would be severe repercussions in terms of the U.S. relationship to the court if the ICC were to ever investigate Palestine. The situation in Palestine, in particular the Israeli offensive in 2009 there, a lot of people were trying to get the court involved, and U.S. officials told the court this would be a disaster for U.S. relations with the court. China, a Chinese official pulled aside the prosecutor at one point. There was, as some of you may recall, there was a shelling by North Korea of some South Korean island, and the ICC said, hey, we might want to take a look at this. a Chinese diplomat pulled aside the prosecutor and said, please don't do that. That would be a mistake. When on Afghanistan again, when the prosecutor indicated that he had some interest in Afghanistan, he got a call from a German official who said, we think this would be a very bad idea. So this is informal signaling that goes on from major powers about what should be investigated. And then, and this might be most important, episodic and highly variable political support to the court, even from major powers who've joined. And so examples of this would be Sudan and Uganda, where you had complex peace negotiations going on. You also had ICC investigations going on. And at various points, several major powers, including ICC member states, toyed with the idea of, couldn't we just shelve the ICC investigation? Can we put it on hold, maybe through the Security Council or some other way, in order to let the diplomatic process run its course? Those kind of conversations were had both in terms of Sudan and Uganda, and they led to a real outburst from the prosecutor, who in 2007 in a speech said, look, I'm tired of people talking about how justice can be turned on and off like it's, a tap of water. You can't turn this on and off. You've got to give us consistent support. And if you're not giving us consistent diplomatic, political support, then you're undermining the institution. But in fact, we have seen, I would argue, highly variable support from major powers. What about the prosecutor side? So I argue that control behavior has been most predominant on the major power side, and it varies by which major power we're talking about to some degree. But what about the prosecutor side? I argue that of those behavioral patterns I outlined, that a strategic approach best captures what the prosecutor and the prosecutor's office has done to this point. And specifically, I think they have gone out of their way to avoid situations where major powers have very strong interest, unless those powers have somehow indicated they want the court involved. And so, where do we see that full investigations, full ICC investigations have been launched? Uganda, Congo, Sudan, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Libya, Mali, although this investigation hasn't gone anywhere yet. Where have they not been launched? Iraq, where the court had limited jurisdiction over the British and also some other countries that participated in the 2003 Iraq War. No full investigation in Afghanistan. No full investigation in Colombia, where the U.S. provides major military assistance to the government there in its effort against FARC rebels. No ICC investigation in Georgia, even though Georgia is a member state and the court had jurisdiction. And this specifically, we're talking about the conflict, the 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict, where there were clearly documented cases of war crimes. And no full investigation in Palestine. The jurisdictional situation is complex there, but there is a way in which the court could have opened an investigation. So we find a pattern then that the court goes, I think, in places where the states are weaker, major power interests are more subdued, or in the case of Libya and Sudan, situations where the major powers may have big interests, but they've explicitly told the court, we want you there, through a Security Council referral. And the court doesn't go in places where I think major power interests are most acute. And I really think the failure to open a full investigation in Afghanistan is particularly notable. You have credible accounts of atrocities, mostly by Taliban and Taliban-associated groups, in a context of intensifying conflict. And if you look at, just as a metric of the intensity of the conflict, if you look at battle deaths in Afghanistan, 2003 to 2006, significantly greater numbers than in Uganda or Congo, where the court did open full investigations. So I think it's very hard to explain the failure to open an Afghanistan investigation other than with great power interests playing a role. And prosecution officials, in a careful way, a deniable way, kind of said this. One prosecution official told me, look, Major powers can throw their weight around. We have no weight. We're the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. If we were purists about everything we do, if we were fully apolitical, I take that to mean, we'd quickly run into trouble. And another official acknowledged that major power involvement in Afghanistan and Georgia loomed large in terms of the court's considerations about whether to open an investigation there. So, and I think the prosecutor has also been quite careful about using that moral authority that I've talked about. There's an important distinction here. They have yelled and screamed, the prosecutor and prosecution officials have yelled and screamed about investigations that are already open when they feel like they're not getting support, but they have not yelled and screamed about situations where they don't have jurisdiction, where they might want to get jurisdiction. So you don't see the prosecutor campaigning for jurisdiction. And I asked the former prosecutor about that, and he said, that's not my job. It's not my job. I'm not an NGO. I'm not an activist. It's not my job to campaign for jurisdiction. That's a possible interpretation, but it's certainly not inevitable. You could imagine an ICC prosecutor who's thundering away from The Hague about the situation in Syria and saying, give me jurisdiction. There are crimes being committed there. Find a way to give me jurisdiction. But you don't see the prosecutor taking that. And you could imagine a prosecutor, when there's silence from NATO on Afghanistan, you could imagine a prosecutor going to the press. I asked NATO for information, and they didn't provide it. I need that information to be able to investigate. No. Quiet has been the approach of the prosecutor in terms of the jurisdiction of the court. Now, I do not believe the evidence supports, and I think there is strong evidence against the notion that the prosecutor has been captured by major powers. I do not think that's the case, and there are just a couple of examples I'll briefly go through to explain that. First of all, once the Sudan investigation had been launched, there came the question of how high up the Sudanese chain of command do you go? So the ICC initially indicted a couple of ministerial level people, and the question then became, do they go after Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, who many people believed was intricately involved in the violence in Darfur and in managing the overall counterinsurgency strategy. The prosecutor clearly signaled that he was thinking about it. He was thinking about indicting Bashir. And he very clearly heard from major power diplomats, we don't think it's a good idea. It's going to complicate things. He had a quiet meeting in Chicago with a U.S. official. The U.S. official said, I think you're making a mistake if you go after Bashir. He heard the same thing from the Russians, the Chinese, the British, and the French. He went ahead anyway. So this is not, the prosecutor has not been taking direction. He does not take orders from even major powers. Okay? But that's a different question of once an investigation has been launched, your strategy of who to go after, and the question of what investigations you launch. Another example, the timing of the indictment against Muammar Gaddafi. The Security Council had referred the situation in Libya to the court, but it had referred it before NATO got involved militarily in Libya. And as some of you will recall, during the first early months of the NATO intervention in Libya, things looked pretty messy. It looked like it might be kind of falling apart. Gaddafi's forces were proving quite resilient. NATO was bombing. There was a lot of controversy. And I think the United States in particular got nervous. And they said, what is the effect of these? If the court indicts Gaddafi, does that mean we can't negotiate some kind of quiet exile for him? What does this mean about the diplomatic strategy for getting out of this intervention in Libya? And the prosecutor in The Hague, after he had clearly signaled he might go after senior officials in the Gaddafi regime, got a call. He got a call from Samantha Power, who is now U.S. ambassador to the UN, and he got a call on the same call, from Harold Koh, the legal advisor at the State Department. And accounts differ as to what was said on the call, but the prosecutor, it seems clear from ICC officials I've talked to, felt pressured. He felt that the word from Washington was, go slow on these indictments. It may not be helpful to have Gaddafi indicted. That could complicate the diplomatic solution, some kind of diplomatic avenues here. He felt quite pressured, and he was somewhat angry about it. Samantha Power and Harold Coe told me that's not what was said. It was just a brainstorming session about how everything meshes together, how does the politics go along with the justice piece. And so, you have different accounts of that. But it seems clear the prosecutor felt there was some pressure. He nonetheless went ahead with the indictment of Gaddafi. So I think this is important evidence that the prosecutor does not simply take direction from even the leading major power, but in terms of the overall investigative strategy of the court, I think there is clear evidence that the interests of major powers are taken into consideration. So we end up then, I argue, with this process of mutual accommodation. Marginalization is over as a strategy, at least for now, but the prosecutor and the ICC have operated extremely carefully about what cases they take and what cases they don't. What are the implications of all this? It's been important for the ICC that there has been this mutual accommodation, because it is very hard to operate as an international institution, a fragile new institution, when you have major powers who are hostile to you and working to undermine the institution. And so it's been very important then that some accommodation has been reached. The U.S. has provided significant assistance to the court in a case-by-case basis, including recently there was a suspect who turned himself in Rwanda to the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. Facilitated his transfer to the ICC. So it's been important for the institution. Japan came aboard fully as a member state, even though it was quite skeptical, and that's been financially very important for the court because Japan became the largest funder of the ICC. But it's important to recognize that we're only a decade into the court's history. This trajectory that I've argued exists, this trajectory of caution toward the major powers, could well change. And one view might be this is a natural first phase for the institution, that the court has to be careful at the beginning, needs to build up its resources, build itself up as an institution, and then later on it can take on more ambitious, controversial cases, maybe be willing to cross swords with some major powers. But this should be seen perhaps as a phase in the court's history. My guess, and it really can only be a guess, is that this is going to be a more lasting feature of the ICC's operations. And there is a significant amount of scholarship in other areas of international organizations that talk about the informal control of international institutions, powerful states finding ways to control institutions, at least where their vital interests are at stake. And so my guess would be this is going to be a longer-term pattern in terms of ICC behavior, that it's going to operate, but it's going to operate within certain geopolitical constraints. The big question for the ICC, and I would submit for global governance and international institutions as a whole, is this acceptable to the rest of the world? Is the rest of the world willing to live with institutions that operate but are constrained by political realities? Now, one might argue the world has lived with that for decades now. There's all sorts of hypocrisy in the international system. There's a UN Security Council which gives certain key powers a veto, and that grates on lots of small powers, but they live with it. You can argue, though, it's less tolerable to states in the international justice context, which is explicitly supposed to be apolitical. And so the backlash that you've seen, for example, from a lot of African leaders about the ICC, the complaints about why have investigations only been opened in Africa, why have they not been opened elsewhere, that's a major challenge for the court, and it's a sign that perhaps elements of the international community are going to be less amenable to this kind of major power constraints, these kind of geopolitical constraints on this new institution. So I will leave it there and would love to take any questions.
much, David. I'm going to let David take his own questions. I am going to, I do want to say, however, I neglected earlier, and I'm going to atone for that by thanking our Global Governance, Politics, and Security program for hosting this event, and thank our program director, Mike Schroeder, and Schroeder, our program coordinator, for helping to set this up. And I want to make sure, because I'm going to have to go momentarily to Memorial Service across the street, that Mike, because he could go on all afternoon. So at 2:30, he's going to move from answering questions to signing books. And I just want to make sure people know that there are books there if you wish to add to your collection. So again, thanks.
Okay.
And
Thanks, Sam.
take the question.
Yeah, Phil.
I have a mic.
Oh, yeah, the mic.
David, this was a terrific presentation. Thank you very much. Can you tell us where the Obama administration is contrasted, maybe with, if there is a contrast with the Bush administration with respect to the ICC?
Yeah, the Obama administration has been, came into office with people much more favorable to the ICC. The kind of John Bolton type people who were very skeptical of the ICC and had been in the Bush administration. Those people were replaced by people like Harold Koh, a human rights professor who became the legal advisor at State. Samantha Power becomes a key NSC official, very supportive of the ICC. Other people like that, and one official who worked in both the Bush and Obama administrations described the Obama administration as like an ICC glee club, initially. But and so they have taken certain steps, certain important steps toward making the relationship closer. I mentioned the Rwanda transfer. There's been a rewards for justice program that now the Obama administration has extended to people who've been indicted by the ICC. There's a U.S. program where people who turn these people in can get rewards. So there have been some important steps. The U.S. attends now regularly meetings of the ICC. But I would argue, actually, that the relationship between the U.S. and the court had already changed fairly dramatically with the second Bush administration. And really with that Sudan referral, that really changed things, notably. And I interviewed Condoleezza Rice for the book, and she talked about some of the ways in which the Bush administration changed during its second term toward a much more accommodating posture toward the ICC. But a lot of it was done quietly in the second Bush administration. The U.S. point person on war crimes, whenever he was in The Hague, would quietly have dinner with the prosecutor. But the prosecutor would never set foot in the ICC, and the prosecutor would never come to the State Department. When the Obama administration comes in, the prosecutor goes to the White House, goes to the State Department. So the things come out in the open more, I would say. But I don't think fundamentally it's changed all that much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Bosco. Just out of curiosity, most of the interaction between the U.S. and the ICC has been on the executive level. Has there been much involvement on the congressional level, or are we set for some sort of spectacular blow-up like with UNESCO?
The Congress has been involved, and they were quite involved initially during the marginalization phase when they passed something called the American Service Members Protection Act, which was essentially legislation forbidding the United States to give any support to the ICC and authorizing the U.S. to use military force should an American be detained by the ICC, which has been referred to as the Hague Invasion Act. And a bunch of activists in The Hague actually symbolically created bunkers on the beaches to prevent the invading American troops. So Congress has been very involved, but Congress has gotten quite a bit more quiet recently because the ICC has been doing things that are largely consistent with U.S. interests. Now you can bet we're the prosecutor tomorrow to say I'm opening a full investigation in Palestine, that there would be an outcry in Congress and probably new legislation would be offered. But for the moment, Congress has kind of relaxed on the ICC front. Yes?
With the criticism that the ICC is just like bringing in African representatives or leaders, why, like, is this a good baby step for the ICC to see if that they can actually like put their jurisdiction jurisdiction across the world, or is it a negative effect that we're just seeing? It's really just geopolitics and it's
Yeah.
really just regional.
Well, first of all, I don't want anything that I've said to suggest that I don't think those cases that the court has launched in Africa are legitimate. I mean, those are extraordinary, many of them are extraordinarily serious situations. Sudan and other ones. There were major atrocities, and I think it's quite clear there should have been ICC investigations there. So I wouldn't characterize them as baby steps. But in a sense, in a geopolitical sense, you could see it that way because it's a way for the court to kind of get up and running, figure things out, figure out how to conduct investigations. It has to work through all sorts of legal issues that have been litigated between the trial chamber and the appellate chamber, and these things have slowed down trials considerably. So the ICC is really still working through a lot of that. And so, again, this might go to the interpretation that this is an institution that is going slowly, carefully at first, before it gets into some kind of highly volatile geopolitical situation where it may face the anger and animosity of a major power. Yes, in the back, yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the relationship between some of the human rights actors like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch in creating the normative effect that you mentioned Sakink was arguing for?
Yeah.
Do they have an impact, and if so, what is it?
I think they do have an impact. The ICC from its very beginnings has benefited from an enormously involved, active, passionate NGO community, activist community that has supported this institution. Many of the diplomats at Rome remember the NGOs being as important at Rome in some respects as the diplomats. They were providing information to national delegations. They were, privately counseling them on what amendments to adopt, publicly chastising them. Enormously important, and there's a coalition for the International Criminal Court which has remained very, very active, including and encouraging ratification of the Rome Statute. It's trying to push toward universal ratification. So they've been very active. I expect they'll continue to be active. But the reality of the ICC in practice has been complicated. And I think that has maybe taken a little bit of the edge off of the advocacy campaign, because it's one thing to advocate for the creation of an institution. Then when you see the institution in practice and it has problems and it has deficiencies, and I think that has taken some of the edge off, but still remains a very potent force in terms of generating public support for the ICC. Yeah, Sakina.
Thanks, David. Great talk. Given the amount of delegated discretion that you mentioned the prosecutor has,
Yeah.
it seems to me that an important piece of this picture is who that person is and what's the process by which they're appointed or chosen. Can you speak a little bit to what role, if any, major powers play in that process,
Yeah.
and what the relationship is between the prosecutor and I guess how that appointment process impacts the way the prosecutor makes decisions or not?
Yeah. That's a great question, because really it is this enormous amount of discretion, and it is ultimately in the hands of this one person, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, with some, of course, things that the prosecutor does can get checked and reviewed by judges. But the process there have been only two prosecutors. The first prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo from Argentina, he was selected kind of on a consensus basis. And it really was several of the key member states, Britain, France, Germany, a couple of others, who really played a critical role in deciding who was going to be an acceptable candidate to be the first prosecutor. And so when Moreno Ocampo was being considered, he hopped on a plane to go interview informally with several of these states. And they interviewed him. And then once they felt comfortable with him, it was kind of presented to the rest of the ICC membership as, this is a candidate we think can work, and it was decided to do it by consensus. But I think the fact that he traveled to several of the most powerful states that had joined the ICC was, recognition that these states are going to have, a significant say, should have a significant say in who the prosecutor is going to be. It was a much more open process for the second. The prosecutors have 9-year terms, non-renewable terms, And so for the second prosecutor, it was a more open process. There was a search committee set up. But I do think it's relevant that the second prosecutor, who is Fatou Bensouda, had served as Ocampo's deputy for 5 or 6 years, was already well-versed in the court. But, and I argue in the book, it was important that she, in a sense, had bought into the court's investigative strategy. She was not an outsider. She was someone who was highly invested in the strategy that the court had taken, and which, I would argue, the major powers were basically comfortable. But yes, it was a more open process. It was seen as quite important, given the African complaints about the court, that the second prosecutor be African, and she is. Yes?
Hi there. This isn't my expert area, so please point out any holes in this question. But my understanding is that if you sign on to the court, that any citizen of your country, including the head of state, can be indicted. Hypothetically, if a member state, if the head of state of that country were indicted, how do you think they would behave, and what would be the consequences of not allowing that person to get sent to The Hague?
Right. You are right that there is no head of state immunity that's specifically excluded in the Rome Statute, and so a head of state is not immune and can be prosecuted, and has been prosecuted. The Sudanese president has been indicted. Muammar Gaddafi was indicted. He met justice in a different way. So we have, and the current Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta, has also been not formally indicted, but essentially the same thing. He's been charged with crimes. And so we do have some experience of that. Sudan has simply said, we're never sending Bashir, and forget about it. The ICC is illegitimate. And so every time now that Omar al-Bashir travels from Sudan, there's this kind of parlor game of, is he going to go to a country that's an ICC member? Is he going to, is there a chance that he'd be arrested somehow? And the prosecutor, I think, had ideas that somehow, warplanes might intercept Omar Bashir's plane and, bring him to The Hague. It hasn't happened. And Bashir has traveled to several ICC member states who have not turned him over to the court. So we're seeing that play out right now. But it is very much a cat and mouse game that is going on with Bashir. And Kenyatta is an interesting case. The Kenyan president, ostensibly Kenya and Kenyatta are cooperating with the court. So they're saying when it comes to trial, we'll participate. The deputy president, his trial has already started, but there's a lot of evidence, and I think the court would argue that Kenya is trying to sabotage these prosecutions from within by making it hard for witnesses to travel to the court, by trying to get some witnesses to recant their testimony. And so that's an example of ostensible cooperation with the court, but in reality, some undermining of the court processes. Yeah, John.
Thanks, Dave. Would you outline again?
Just maybe the mic, because it's being...
Would you outline again, or just go over the basic motives as to why the strong powers are not joining the ICC? I mean, is it a matter of a threat of their independence, or their sovereignty, or what?
Yeah, I think, first of all, from a jurisdictional standpoint, if you join the ICC, if the U.S. joins the ICC, that means wherever U.S. forces might be deployed, the ICC has jurisdiction over them. And so by not joining, you don't eliminate the possibility of ICC jurisdiction over Americans, because they could still be prosecuted if they're operating on the territory of a member state, like Afghanistan. But you limit it. You limit it. And so from a simple jurisdictional standpoint, there's a clear incentive not to join and to minimize your exposure to the ICC. But I think more broadly, when you join and you take on a treaty obligation to this court, you are saying, we back this court. You are saying, we will arrest anyone who comes onto our territory who's been indicted by the court. You're taking on a whole host of legal obligations to the court. And so I think both at the jurisdictional level and at that broader level of support, these key major powers have decided that they're not ready to take that step. And I wouldn't anticipate, I would be shocked if the United States or China or Russia join the court anytime in the foreseeable future. Well, there's an argument that they've committed some violations. Yeah. Yeah, Jeff.
Thanks, David. So my question, I guess, is related to that. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the universal jurisdiction movement and whether it will be sort of reignited to hold those who refuse to be held accountable to the court. I'm just thinking, the Bush systematic torture, arguably war of aggression, possible war crimes in the drones program. Will countries try and fill that void?
The universal jurisdiction idea is an important development in international law, and it's a different development from the ICC, which is not really universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is the notion that any state anywhere in the world can prosecute individuals who've committed certain heinous crimes, including torture, crimes against humanity, genocide. Doesn't matter if it occurred on their territory, if they have any connection to it, they can prosecute. And that is, some people think, an alternative to this kind of thing, is that you simply get states to start those prosecutions so that any official who may have been involved in those crimes has to think about any country they're going to travel to. Is that country going to arrest me, prosecute me? The Pinochet case was kind of the real most notable example of a universal jurisdiction prosecution. We've seen some others. I actually think the tendency toward universal jurisdiction is on the decline. I think states have realized it's enormously complex and disruptive diplomatically to undertake these prosecutions. So my guess is that we're not going to see a lot of universal jurisdiction prosecutions, certainly for heads of state or ministers. In the book, I talk a little bit about what happened when Belgium, through Belgium's court processes, there were some investigations launched of senior U.S. officials for the Iraq War in 2003. And, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld went to Belgium and he said, either you find a way to stop these or we'll find a new home for NATO. Okay, if you want NATO to be in Brussels, figure out a way to stop these prosecutions. And Belgium changed their law. And I think that is evidence that these kind of universal jurisdiction prosecutions are not going to be a major element in this struggle. Yeah. Maybe just get the mic because it's being recorded.
I was wondering if you could turn to the question that you left us with, that some of the non-major power states, particularly in Africa, are frustrated with the major power control of the court. And I'm curious what you think the outcomes of that might be, if there's any sort of nascent revolution brewing or...
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point because Kenya has been kind of at the forefront of complaints about the ICC since its president is may soon be prosecuted. And Sudan obviously has also been very hostile to the ICC. So has Uganda, interestingly, even though Uganda was fairly supportive of the ICC initially. There was discussion of whether there should be a mass withdrawal of African states from the ICC because a large number of African states are members of the court. And so there's been talk about that. It hasn't gone anywhere yet. Kenya tried to kind of agitate for that and tried to gin up some support for a mass withdrawal of African states. But I would say the relationship right now is in a very difficult place where these complaints are out there, but it's not yet clear whether there's going to be a withdrawal of African states. There is the possibility that an African regional court might be empowered to conduct its own criminal investigations, which might displace the ICC. Essentially, there'd be an African regional court that would say, we're going to prosecute these crimes. And under the doctrine of complementarity, the ICC might need to step away if that regional court is going to do things. I think that's a more likely alternative than a kind of mass withdrawal of African states. Yeah, Ben.
I wondered if you could speak about the larger countries that are in the ICC, Britain, France,
Yeah.
Japan. Because they are in the ICC, have they kind of acted as like a brake on the ICC, or have they been clamoring for it to go faster?
I wouldn't say they've been clamoring for it to go faster. I mean, they are a really interesting case because these behavior patterns that I outlined for major powers, you might say, well, why would they apply to a major power that has decided to join the court, that supported it? But my reasoning was that they still might see the court as ultimately a threat or desire to control it. We have seen interesting behavior. I mean, Britain and France were quite instrumental in helping undermine the U.S. marginalization campaign. So in that sense, they were really working on the court's behalf to help bring the superpower on board. And Condoleezza Rice talked about how she got a phone call from the British foreign minister saying, you know, what can you do to help out the court a little bit? And, you know, she said, well, we can do this and this, but we can't do this. So they were really kind of helping to broker a kind of rapprochement between the court and the superpower. But I think to the frustration of the ICC, their behavior has not, I would say, reached the level of kind of acceptance that I outlined, where you're offering consistent support across situations to the court. And particularly in Sudan, I think there was a lot of frustration because the British and French were both talking about potentially shelving one of the indictments, the indictment of Bashir, trying to shelve that through the Security Council, which was very frustrating to the prosecutor. So I think they are certainly more supportive, but I would argue that their behavior still falls more into the control category than into the full acceptance category. Yeah?
I'm going to ask you to take a ride in the future, speculate down 50 to 75 years from now. If the ICC is successful in existence, is this the end of war as we see it, have seen it in the past?
No. I will go on the record as saying it's not the end. You know, there's one interesting question is, to what degree does the ICC or does international prosecutions, do they deter people from committing these crimes? Could they deter countries from going to war at all? And there's a big debate about what kind of deterrent effect the court has. I think right now, you know, you're seeing a lot of evidence that the deterrent effect is minimal. You know, now, it could be down the road that it's more significant, and it would be a kind of gradual process, I think. But no, I feel fairly confident in arguing that the ICC is not going to have banished war or atrocities.
Well, first of all, on behalf of Global Governance, Politics, and Security, thank you all for coming today. Particularly thank David one more time. Just a couple things. Number one, lots of food over here. In fact, I bet my program coordinator that we could get rid of it all, so unless I have to buy coffee, unless you guys can finish this, help yourselves. Secondly, books for sale outside. David will be out there signing books. He's probably got some clever witticism he can put in yours. So get out there, buy a book, and again, be careful out there in the cold.
And can I just say thank you again to Charlotte for all the organizing that she did for this event. Thanks, Mike.